Now let's talk about camera tracking. There are a lot of times where the videos you are working with are not stable shots. They were not shot on a stabilizer or on a tripod. So you can't use a simple software like F-Spy to align the camera of such videos because the camera is in motion, and that is where camera tracking comes in. And the way this works, the software finds distinct features on your video. So it's basically trying to find points you can attach camera trackers to and follow it throughout the entire video. And we have different softwares that can accomplish camera tracking, including Blender. So in this video, we're going to be talking about how to camera track in Blender. The goal here is to be able to take our video that is in motion and put our default cube on top of it, and you can see the cube being tracked in the scene. So the cube is basically attached to the floor and it seems like it's in the actual real scene. So if you're able to achieve that in a video, you have camera tracked the video. So let's get to it. This is the background video we'll be working with, and you can find this file in the resources folder. So in our default Blender scene, what we have to do is to click on this plus icon and go to VFX, then motion tracking. And then this is an entirely new page. And the only thing you need to have in mind is this here is your 3D viewport. This here is where you track your footage, and this down here is your timeline. So there are a lot of ways to go about this, but this is how I usually do it for most of my videos. I just take the video and drop it here. So this is the video we're going to be tracking. Now let's click and drag this up. The next thing we should do is to click set scene frames. You can see our frames are 250, but we want to match it to the frames of the video. So click on set scene frames, and now we have 432 frames, 33 frames. The next thing you should do is to click on prefetch. Now what prefetch does, you can see it's writing prefetching here. It's loading. You're basically loading the video into your memory so you can easily preview it. Now when the prefetching is done, make sure you're on the first frame. So just shift left arrow and you get to frame 1. Now click on detect features. So when you click the button, Blender basically tries to find distinct high contrast features in your video that it could decide to track. So you can see the middle of this tile here, this paving stone, is a feature that Blender wants to track. So throughout the video as we play forward, Blender will try to follow it. As you can see, these points are not following anything, they are just on the screen. But the goal is for Blender to follow every single thing on the screen. So let's click detect features again. When you click it, you can see this pop up here. When we click these detect features, we can make some adjustments. For example, we can reduce the threshold, and when we reduce the threshold, Blender finds even more features. It's more dense. When we increase the threshold, it finds fewer features. So it depends on the scene. I think this one is already great as it is, but let's just make it around here. So this is quite enough tracking points for Blender to attempt to follow. Now, after we have done that, let's click on this button, track markers, or you can hit Ctrl T, whichever works. And as you can see, Blender is basically tracking those points from the beginning to the end. So if I go to the beginning again, you can see the points. Now if I'm scrubbing through the footage, you can see Blender is now following the points. So the markers are following each of those points on the floor and on the buildings. Let's go back. That is usually my first tracking pass. The next thing I do is to go to the last frame. So shift right arrow, frame 433. Detect features again. So you are basically telling Blender, go to the last frame at the end of the video and find different features here and also track it backwards. So at the beginning, Blender picked all these points and then followed it to the end. And at the end, you want Blender to pick some points and follow it back to the beginning. You can hit Alt D to clear out these red squares. They are cluttering up the screen. So from here, we can click track backwards. So this is it, or Ctrl Shift T. So Blender basically follows those points you found at the end up to the beginning. Now just to make sure the tracking is airtight, because you can see at the beginning, we can see this part of the video where this shadow is. But at the end, we can't see any of those shadows. You can't see any of that part of the video. So if Blender is tracking from the beginning and it follows this shadow, by the time you get here, there's nothing to follow because the shadow is gone at the end. So just to make sure you covered all grounds, let's put it somewhere in the middle of the video. Say 210. At frame 210, we'll do the same thing. Click on detect features. So you're telling Blender at this frame, find things to track. And then click on track backwards. So at this specific frame, it finds new things and follows it to the beginning. Then go back to that frame, 210. Then detect features again. So it's basically the same features to detect. Then track forwards. So you're basically telling Blender if there is anything you didn't see when you detected features in the beginning or the end, you can find them in the middle and track them on either side. So the next thing you need to do is to drag this up so you can see the graph properly. Now this graph is basically showing you the motion of each of these trackers. So each of these trackers are represented by this graph. Some of them flow with the video and just flow with the exact thing they are meant to follow. But sometimes they don't follow the exact point accurately. It's software. Sometimes it misses it. Sometimes it goes out of frame. Sometimes it's trying to follow a person. If there is someone like me, my hands are moving. So you can't use my hands to track the camera. You should use things that are stable. When you are running a camera track, the camera itself should be the only thing that is moving. Any other thing that is moving in the scene should not be tracked. You should make sure your track points are attached to very stationary things in the background. Now, if we scroll past, you could see that there was a bike that was passing by. So basically what you're trying to achieve here is to clear out all these other lines. All these lines you see here, they are track markers that just went out of bounds. They just went astray. They didn't follow how the video flowed. But the majority of lines you see here, these red ones that are going here in the middle, and these green ones that is intersecting with it in the middle, those are the accurate lines. They are the lines that are actually following the video. So as you can see, as I'm selecting each of these markers, it's also selecting the markers in the scene. So as I select this one that is going crazy, you can see it here. And at this point where it pops up, where it spikes, the marker is going where it's not supposed to be. Look, let me just show you. This is the marker. You can see it's following the flow now. Then it goes crazy. This is an example of a good one right here. You can see as I'm going back and forth, it's just following where it's meant to be. It's just sticking to the flow. But this one we have selected is going crazy at this point. It just starts moving crazy. You can see some at the back here, like this one is also moving crazy. You don't want that. You want every single marker to attach to a point on the floor and stay there. That is how you create a camera track. The software is basically spreading the entire scene with points and making sure it follows every point. So when the camera is moving in different ways and the software is also following every single point, you can replicate the movement of the camera. That's basically the technology behind it. So let's just click on this stray markers, this, and X to delete. X to delete, X to delete, all these ones that are going out of bounds. What you should have is something that looks like a line. Not exactly a straight line, but a graph that is very tight. All these ones with spikes, we want them to be gone. So just X to delete. Blender tracking process is very manual. You're really inside the process. In our next lesson, we'll talk about tracking with After Effects, which is quite automatic. You just click a couple buttons. So we're deleting even more. In the end, we want to have something that looks like a smooth graph. Just going from left to right. Let's take this one out, take this one out, take this one out. Some videos are easier to track and some are harder to track. It's just what it is, especially in Blender. And some are pretty much impossible to track. So we have something like this, and this is quite cool. Now you can see most of the markers, if we look now, most of the markers are attached to the floor. You're not seeing any dancing happening anymore. There's no craziness, there's no marker that is just going crazy and shaking out of the blue. Most of them are focusing on their point accurately. But now you can see this one. Look at this one. This one is dancing. What I was about to say is that some markers are still not very accurate. So to get 100% accuracy, each of the markers should stick 100% on that specific point and know exactly where the camera is moving. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Like this marker, we can see it's not sticking to the exact point. From afar, it looks like it is. From afar, it looks like it's sticking to the point. But when you zoom in, you can see it's really dancing around the point. While something like this is sticking exactly to the point. You can see it's following wherever the point is going. So let's just delete this one. Okay, now we want to solve the camera motion. Now we have put a lot of markers on the scene. Now I want Blender to take all this information and solve the camera motion and approximate where it thinks the camera would be and where the motion of the camera is. So let's bring this down. We are done here. Now there are a lot of settings here, but 99% of the time I don't even tamper with anything here. That's the thing with Blender tracking. It can get very, very detailed and very into it. Now let's go to solve. We were in the track tab, and that is where we did the tracking to put the markers to follow the camera. Then go to solve. Now you can just hit solve camera motion right out the gate. Now after a few seconds, you can see up here solve error 4.57 pixel. The best way to describe this is a perfect track would give you 0 pixel solve error. That means every single tracker that has been positioned on a particular pixel stays exactly on that pixel and doesn't even move by 1 pixel or by 0.1 pixel. It's just there. But a solve error of 4.57 means that the average of all these markers, some of them are not actually positioned perfectly. So you need to clean it. You need to remove the ones that are not accurate, the ones that are not really sticking. And you can't just use your eyeballs. That would be super stressful to zoom into every single one and look at the ones that are still shaking even a little bit. but Blender can do that for you using software. Also, when you are placing trackers, you should go through the scene and make sure there is no marker on a moving object. Like this guy, for example, this biker, there shouldn't be a marker on him, because as I said before, Blender wants to track the movement of the camera. So it needs to position these markers on things that are stationary relative to the camera that is moving. So if you're also putting it on something that is moving, you are messing up the camera track. Our biker doesn't have any tracker on him. If he had one, we just need to click on it and X to delete, but he has none on him. This marker right here is for this stone at the back. So let's go forward and see, make sure it's not following any of these people at the back. Make sure it's not following this car. Yeah, you can see. Yeah, you can see this marker is following the car. That would just mess up the track. If you have a lot of these markers that are just following things that are not stationary, it messes up your track. So click on this and delete. You see, there's also one here, delete. So you don't want any marker on moving objects up until it goes out of frame. You don't want any marker on the car. Cool. Also some guidelines: if you have trees in the scene with branches that are moving all around the place, you don't want that. But if you have leaves like this or thick branches where the leaves are not moving, you can leave the tracking markers on it. That is all right. But when you have leaves that are moving around the place, that messes up your track. So good markers here. This is a marker on whatever that is in the sky. This is a marker on the top of the roof, on the chimney, on the top of this roof, on this street light. So they're positioned in the right places. Let's hit soft camera motion again to see if those two error markers made any difference. Now we have a 4.59. Can you imagine? If there's one thing you need to know about Blender camera tracker, sometimes it's just going to annoy you and things just go out of whack. I know what I'm saying. I tracked about 23 videos last month during my 30-day challenge, and I was frustrated a lot of times. I was very frustrated because I was trying to avoid tracking with other softwares like After Effects and all that. I wanted the tutorials to just be in Blender, but I realized that sometimes you just need to use a better software, a better camera tracker. But still, in this course, I'm going to teach you how to track with Blender, and I'm going to teach you how to track with After Effects. After Effects is better at tracking, but you need to know how to track with Blender in case you don't want to get After Effects, you don't want to have to pay for it and all of that, or you don't want to think about another software. You can use Blender to do all your tracking. It's just that sometimes it will stress your life. So let's clean up this track, basically taking out the ones that are not super accurate. Let's go to this cleanup tab, click it, then click clean tracks. Then you would see three options here: tracked frames, reprojection error. Now you want to increase this reprojection error. Increase it to a point where you have some of the markers selected. So the more you increase it, the less markers it selects. If you bring it down, it selects even more. So let's take it to a point where we have few of the markers selected, but not a lot, like this. We have some of these markers here, some here, some here, some here, but not a lot. It's not the majority, it's not up to half. So when we have selected some of them, you can hit X and delete. Basically, we just selected some of the worst markers, some of the markers with the worst reprojection errors, and we deleted them. Now, when we saw camera motion again, because we have deleted the bad markers, the one with high errors, we should have a lower solve error. See, we have a 4.15, lower than 4.5, but we can do better than that. The goal is to try to get to lower than 0.5. Anything lower than 0.5 is a good solve error, but then you want to get it even lower. You want to try to get to a 0.3 or a 0.2, even a 0.1, but then anything lower than 0.5, you can work with it in Blender. So let's clean tracks again and drag this up again and select just a few more. X to delete and soft camera motion. Blender camera tracker only needs 8 markers to track the footage, minimum of 8. So if it has 8, it can actually track it. Now we have a 2.68 pixel solve error. We are getting it down, but we want it to be less than 1 and less than 0.5. So let's clean tracks again, drag this again. You just need to repeat this process till you have something that you are comfortable with. So soft camera motion again. Now this is Blender just guessing, right? Trying to approximate where they think the camera is. Now we have 2.17. Now this settings here, you basically use it to refine the solve. So if I click on focal length, you would see it says refine focal length during camera solving. So it's trying to figure out what the focal length is and use it in the solve. If I check optical center, it's also doing the same thing. If I check radial distortion, it's also doing the same thing. It's basically taking that extra information and adding it to the solve. So what I usually do is to use focal length and optical center to refine the solve. And I click soft camera motion again. So we have a 0.49. Let's work with that. The next thing you want to do is to scroll down and click on setup tracking scene. So Blender basically creates a tracking scene for you, which is basically a floor plane, the cube, and then the track markers. These markers represent each of these track markers in your actual scene. So this is a 2D image and we placed markers on them. But here we have a 3D space that has all the markers represented in 3D, like how they should actually look. And you can see as we are moving to and fro, our camera is actually moving in 3D space to represent how the camera is moving in this track. So the next thing we need to do is to set up our floor. Blender doesn't know where the floor is. So the next thing we need to do is to go to our output and switch these two values. So this is resolution, the aspect ratio. We need to switch it because it's a vertical video. This is showing it as if it's horizontal, but we need to make it 1080p by 1920. So it's a vertical video now. Yeah. Now the next thing we need to do is to click on 3 points on the floor. So let's say this, this, and this. You're basically trying to draw a triangle on the floor to let Blender know where the flat plane is, where you want to build your entire 3D scene on top of. Now that we have selected 3 points, you could select any 3 points. I could have selected this, this, and this, or this, this, and this, or this, this, and this. Basically just drawing a triangle on the floor. Then when you have done that, come down here and hit floor. Yeah, now Blender basically finds where your floor is and places the scene and aligns everything. Now when I hit play, you should see we should be pretty much tracked into the scene. Yeah, if I scroll back and forth, we should basically be moving through the scene. Now that we have this, let's click on our cube, edit mode, GZ1 to bring it to the top, as we usually do, so we can scale from the bottom. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, and I will see whether it's actually on top of the floor. Something else I always do is to click on the ground and make it invisible. Just press this eyeball here. And then we can now look closely and see that our object is actually tracked. You can see the bottom is where you look at to see if something is tracked well. If the connecting point between the object and the floor is just smooth, you can see our cube looks like it's inside the scene. Also, you can see here that when we set up tracking scene, Blender added a couple collections for us, the foreground and the background, added the ground, labeled it for us, and added the cube and the camera. So the last thing we need to do here is to set scale, and this is very important, especially if you are trying to run a simulation. Even without a simulation, anything that requires a shallow depth of field would be messed up if you don't get your scale. So let's make sure the scale is correct, and we can just eyeball it. The only way to actually get this accurately is if you measured the floor when you were shooting, and this is something you don't need to think about. It's like an extra step if you want to work with high-level production. On the actual scene, you measure 2 points on the floor, and then you know the actual measurement, so you can put it in here. But since we don't know that, the only thing we know is this cube, your Blender cube, the actual size is 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, so it's 2 by 2 by 2, your cube. So knowing that, you just want to make sure this cube looks like a 2 meter cube in your scene. For context, this is what 1 meter looks like, 100 cm. It is quite long, so you're trying to make sure your cube looks like it is times 2 of this. So if I look into the scene, the cube looks quite big. It actually looks like it is about 2 meters. But how you basically set your scale is to select 2 of these trackers on the floor and then click set scale. This will basically approximate the size of the entire scene. So you can see clicking set scale made the entire scene bigger, which made our cube smaller. If we select 2 points that are far from each other, this and this one all the way over here, and we hit set scale, it's going to make the scene small, making our cube super big. This cube right here is a lot bigger than 2 meters. Let me undo. This cube right here is a lot smaller than 2 meters. But this, I think this is just about 2 meters big. Maybe I have a very horrible sense of scale, but yeah, this is something accurate. It's very close. And it will do for this lesson. Something else we can do is to align the orientation. Click on this one here, set y-axis. You can see the difference. It basically tries to align this y-axis with this line. Yeah, so when we move on the y, G, Y, we are following the road, which is just very convenient. So I think that is all we have to do here. We don't need to set background. We already have the image as the background. We have set scale. We have done all this. Cool. If you made actual measurements, instead of just clicking set scale, like say we click this and this, instead of just clicking set scale, you need to put in the actual measurement, the actual distance between these 2 points in real life in here. So Blender gives you the exact scale. But then I think we are pretty good here. This is how big this cube should be. a 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter cube. So we can go back to our layout tab. Come here to layout. Let's turn on our ground. Let's go in the scene. Now we can change the size of our cube since we already know how it should look. And look, our cube is tracked to the scene. Let's bring it over here. Yeah, we have achieved the result of tracking this to the scene. It looks like the cube is right there. This is my process when I am tracking in Blender. So we are also going to go over tracking in After Effects, and when we have been able to do that in both Blender, this exact scene in both Blender and also in After Effects, then we'll try creating a scene, a cool animation inside of the scene.